presentation on historic. Welcome to our presentation on historic preservation planning for a more resilient Fort Lauderdale. I'm Tricia Logan. I'm the Historic Preservation Board Liaison for the City of Fort Lauderdale. This presentation is part of a preparation for our strategic historic preservation plan that was identified as the first goal of our comprehensive plan for the city. And we've obtained funding from the Florida Department of State in order to support this effort and to hire the Craig Group, who will be giving this presentation tonight. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lisa Craig to get us started.
Great, thank you, Tricia, I appreciate it. I'm gonna ask Kim, who's handling our slides today, to move forward with the next slide and we'll get this rolling. I want to welcome everybody today, and I also want to ensure that you all put on your calendar the date of March 31st, when we will be having a in-person workshop in Fort Lauderdale. More information about that's going to be at the end of this presentation, but this is just a really great primer for that particular workshop. So those of you able to participate this evening, or those of you who will share the link that will be posted on the city's website with others, will benefit from hearing some of the information that we're going into in greater depth than we will be at the workshop, just because of time issues. But we're really going to talk about the preservation plan elements that are in the City of Fort Lauderdale's comprehensive plan. We're going to talk about one of those in particular that relates to resilience. What is resilience? What does it mean? And more importantly, what does it mean for Fort Lauderdale now and in the future? And Angela Shadell with Taylor Engineering, which is a Florida-based engineering firm working very much in the area of coastal planning and resilience. She'll talk a little bit more about her and her work. Risk mapping will also be another thing we'll be discussing. It may seem like a fairly dry topic until you start to see all those maps and understand where historic and cultural resources in Fort Lauderdale may be at risk. I'll talk a bit, as will Angela, about resources that are available in Florida for adapting buildings, cultural sites, neighborhoods to future conditions of sea level rise, extreme precipitation, storm events, and how you can take advantage of it both at the city level, but also at the property owner level. And finally, adaptation strategies for historic properties. This is something that my colleague and I, Kim Rose, have been working on for nearly a decade now in my work, certainly, in communities ranging from Annapolis to Nantucket to New Bern to Oregon, the state of Oregon to the state of Texas, and a lot of work in Florida in particular. So we're here in Fort Lauderdale now, or at least we'll soon be. Next slide. And Tricia just gave us the welcome, so I'll take her off the hook for that slide. Our team, she had mentioned the Craig Group. I have a background in historic preservation that is about 32 years, but the last 10 years of my career, I have been working on this topic of preservation planning, and in particular in communities that are threatened by extreme storm events, by sea level rise, by coastal inundation. So really have benefited in some respects in working in some beautiful communities, Fort Lauderdale being one of them, but at the same time learning a lot about how we can protect our historic assets, our economic assets, our heritage assets, as we move forward into a future that is not quite certain when it comes to disasters and rising tides. So that is my background. I'll ask Angela if she might take a minute or two to introduce herself, and then Kimberly after that. Angela?
Great, thanks Lisa, and thanks so much City of Fort Lauderdale for having us. We look forward to meeting you in person next week. I'm a 5th generation Florida native. I grew up on the West Coast over in Tampa. I joined the Navy and to see the world, and I got to see a lot of that. I was a helicopter pilot. I retired after 25 years in the service, but my last job was teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy, which is a historic, National Historic Landmark. And so I met Lisa Craig there when she was at Annapolis, and I got involved in taking what I knew about sea level rise policy and the engineering behind it and learning how to really integrate that on top of protecting historic properties. So Lisa and I have been working together for about 10 years, and now I'm based in Jacksonville. I retired to Jacksonville. I've been here for 4 years, and I do consulting for the state of Florida and municipalities all over Florida. And just like this, I'm going to talk to you about flood risk mapping, because that's my specialty. Kim?
And my name is Kimberly Rose. I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, but I got my master's in historic preservation in 2020 from the University of Florida's Historic Preservation Program. And my entire career after that has been focused on resilience. I currently live in Nantucket, Massachusetts, where I work as the co-director of the Preservation Institute Nantucket, but also where I work on projects of resilience across the nation and now Trinidad and Tobago with Lisa as preservation associate with the Craig Group. And my focus really is on resilience in historic areas. And so I will hand it back to Lisa to begin our presentation.
Thanks, Kim. So next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about preservation plan elements in the comprehensive plan. Next slide. Okay, so adopted just this past year was Advanced Fort Lauderdale, which is a comprehensive plan for the city of Fort Lauderdale, really a blueprint for orderly and sustainable land development over the next decade and beyond, hence 2040, Advanced Fort Lauderdale 2040. The elements of comprehensive plan, this is pretty standard in most communities, are listed here. Everything from future land use through housing and transportation, looking at infrastructure, water supply, how we address coastal management, a little bit about what we'll be talking about today, community health and safety, conservation, parks and recreation, public school facilities, intergovernmental coordination, capital improvements, and importantly, historic preservation. And the thing I like to stress is while historic preservation may be its own element within the plan, historic preservation is often knit throughout comprehensive plan elements. Housing has a role to play, or historic preservation has a role to play with housing, with conservation, with parks and recreation. And as you'll hear in this presentation, coastal management as we're looking at resilience planning. Next slide. So the comprehensive plan actually aligns with these, what they've called the cylinders of excellence, which are outlined in the larger vision for the city of Fort Lauderdale. And so there are 6 areas that the city is focusing on as part of their fast forward vision. And that is infrastructure, business development, public places, public safety, internal support, and neighborhood enhancement. So historic preservation actually fits under neighborhood enhancement. And the purpose, the goal for neighborhood enhancement is to have healthy and diverse neighborhoods. So we're going to dig a little further now into the historic preservation element. So the principles identified in the historic preservation element in the comprehensive plan are to ensure a high quality of life by identifying, promoting, and preserving the city's historic resources. Those places, those buildings, those experiences that really define and characterize Fort Lauderdale. The city is what we call a certified local government. It has certain stature. It amongst the cities in Florida, it maintains an ordinance, it has a commission, and it has a system by which design review can be conducted and landmarking can be conducted. So it is called a certified local government. They're dedicated to ensuring that preservation is a maintained public policy through both programming and the ordinances, the regulations that are enacted. In addition, the principle of protection of the city's culture by providing information on preserving the city's history is part of it. So while it's about architecture, it's also about archaeology, and it's about the cultural imprint of the city's history on the heritage of Fort Lauderdale. Next slide. So there's 3 goals primarily under the historic preservation element. Those goals, goal 1 includes the city shall prepare and adopt a long-term approach to historic preservation, which identifies and evaluates the city's historic resources. hence why we are launching this strategic historic preservation plan. Goal number 2 is to provide educational and incentive opportunities to further the city's historic preservation goals. So not just looking at the stick side, the regulatory side of preservation, but what are some of the carrots? What are the incentives that could be made available? What information, educational information, can be made available? And then goal number 3 is to ensure historic preservation goals are met through the coordination and implementation of various local, state, and national preservation tools. So again, there is so much information out there and resources available beyond the city of Fort Lauderdale, at the state level, at the federal level, that can certainly assist the city as it's conducting survey work, as it's developing its design guidelines, as it's creating new programming that benefits historic preservation and neighborhood preservation. Next slide. So here are the key objectives. These are measurable ways in which the goals can be evaluated. How are we moving forward? What are the objectives? What are some of the outcomes we're realizing? But even more importantly, what are the actions that occur under each of these goals and objectives? So we're already working now on the Strategic Historic Preservation Plan, so we can check that off as moving forward. Then we have resource identification. Now that really is about understanding and identifying the historic places or potential historic places in the city of Fort Lauderdale. What are the neighborhoods? What are the individual properties that need to be surveyed to understand their history and how they contribute to the larger story of Fort Lauderdale's development and its future? And then there is the recording of those historic resources. How do we capture information? And more importantly, how do we centralize that information in a database that's accessible by individual property owners, by the city, by other city agencies, and even more importantly, by the state of Florida, in developing the state of Florida's master site file of historic resources of significance throughout the state. So another component of the identification and evaluating. Under goal 2, education and incentives, what incentives are in place? And are we notifying property owners about incentives? Are we talking about the valorum tax exemption that is available to property owners who are rehabilitating their properties? Do we talk about the federal rehabilitation tax credits for income producing properties? Are there incentives available that may be tied to what we're going to be talking about later, and that's resilience? Are there grant funds available for nonprofit or cultural institutions, or for the city to take advantage of to conduct some of these surveys, to develop some public education programming? And then educational tools. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about some educational tools that are out there, particularly as it relates to resilience planning, but everything from how can we celebrate preservation in a month in a way that's interesting, showcasing our history. How can we address issues of heritage tourism and help people understand more about the historic places that are part of the visitor experience? So educational tools play a big role, and it's often the best means to educate historic property owners about the importance of preservation and the importance of the sensitive rehabilitation of their properties. And then lastly, goal 3 is coordination, and that's coordination with other agencies, local agencies, obviously the city of Fort Lauderdale, but also looking at county and state agencies and how they can work together to ensure preservation goals are being met and to assist the city of Fort Lauderdale and its residents and property owners with preservation needs. There is the regulatory process in place, the United Land Development regulations. There's also design guidelines that the city has, but they're design guidelines that the city would like to update to ensure that they're addressing all types of resources. Some of the mid-century modern resources that have very unique material and design needs, as well as something we'll be talking about a little bit later, addressing how do we adapt our historic buildings to flooding that we know is coming in the future or to disaster events. Another important element is beefing up the archaeological resource protection, not only identifying locations and sites of significant archaeological interest and value, but also trying to determine how they can be protected or incorporated into sensitive rehabilitation projects. And that gets us even to city-owned resources. Let's start with what the city has the ability to control, and that's city-owned properties. Those can be a great opportunity to serve as models for other historic property owner projects, redevelopment, design, as well as in resilience planning. So that's what we'll be talking quite a bit about today, is resilience and actually some of the intergovernmental coordination that is tied with resilience planning in the city of Fort Lauderdale. Next. So the historic preservation plan element, as I said, incorporates resilience. There are three primary objectives under resilience. The city shall adjust historic preservation and archaeological resource programs according to changing environmental conditions. You're going to hear a lot about that from Angela next, because we do have changing environmental conditions coming our way in Fort Lauderdale. Develop a climate and environment resiliency prioritization based on each individual resource's susceptibility to climate and environmental change and events. In essence, we call that a vulnerability assessment. What properties are particularly vulnerable to flooding, whether we're dealing with extreme storm events, hurricanes, tropical storms, or we're dealing with issues of tidal or coastal flooding. What properties are at risk and which of those properties are really most important to the community. Monitor changes in local economy and development patterns to identify impacts to historic and archaeological resources, and develop a resiliency prioritization of resources that require protection. We'll be talking actually a little bit more on the 31st at the workshop about a very interesting application of that kind of economic risk test in the city of St. Augustine. It's really important to understand how impacts regarding disasters or future conditions with climate and sea level rise may impact our tourism economy, may impact development patterns in historic districts. So extremely important to understand the dollars and cents behind the value for historic resources in Fort Lauderdale. And then this last one actually comes from the element dealing with intergovernmental coordination. This is seeking guidance from the National Park Service and the Florida Department of State's Division of Historical Resources to develop two things: a historic preservation disaster management plan, and to coordinate resource planning with Broward County in post-disaster scenarios. So we want to talk about how we can better prepare Fort Lauderdale's historic assets for disaster, and when disaster hits, how we can look at redevelopment strategies that still protect and at the same time adapt those historic places to future concerns. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela, who's going to talk about resilience in its many forms. Angela?
Thanks. Kim, you can go to the next slide. We can get into the deep stuff of resilience. So as I said in my introduction, I'm an engineer. So I approach resilience from an engineer's standpoint, because that's how I was trained. But just know that resilience, the reason we have to talk about it is because not only is it, what Lisa just said we're going to discuss, and it's really important, is it, I think it has a lot of different definitions depending on who you are and where you come from. So when I say that, I know a lot of chief resilience officers within the state of Florida at different municipalities, and they all have a different definition of resilience. So I want to define for you how I see it and how we're going to discuss it tonight in terms of Fort Lauderdale, and maybe we can redefine it a little bit next week when we're there in person with you. Resilience can be, an economic resilience, as Lisa was talking about. It can be social resilience. It can be ecological for an environmental habitat. It can be disaster resilience, immediate recovery. It can be community resilience. How does a whole community recover from an event? Or it could just be on flooding. So when I think of resilience, I really think about the ability of a community to bounce back very quickly from adversity and to change, to adapt, to become better or stronger without becoming something different. And the reason I think about it that way is because of material science. So any engineers or scientists out there might recognize this stress strain curve. And really what it shows is, you can imagine, we used to, in material science, when I would teach, we would pull a piece of metal, a big piece of metal, they would pull it in a tensile machine, a tensile test. And they would pull it and pull it and pull it, and they'd stop. And they'd pull it and pull it, pull it and stop. And sometimes they would pull it and it would go back to its normal shape. And that's what's happening on that first part of the slope. And that's actually the green area under the curve. It's actually called resilience, literally in material science. It's the ability, that area in the curve of, ooh, you pull this, imagine, plastic, you pull plastic too much and it deforms out of shape. Metal does the same thing. Eventually, once you get to that little bump at the top there, the yield strength that's at the top of the green triangle, that's where now if I pull that metal or that plastic, imagine a person or a community, they're being pulled out of and deformed to where when you take off that stress, they don't return back to how they were. And then eventually over on the far right, they eventually fail. We don't want our communities to fail, nor do we want them to change into something substantially different. And we're seeing that with historic communities all over the United States, as Lisa has said. We'll show you some great examples of things. But I think it's just important to, you can go to the next slide, Kim, is that we want to be able to bounce back quickly from adversity. And that adversity we're going to talk about tonight is just coastal flooding. There are a lot of other climate things, but that is the risk that we're going to talk about, helping Fort Lauderdale and specifically the historic district and properties be more resilient to coastal flooding. You can go on to the next one. So how do we define resilience? And I've been working in this space a while now, and I really think it's important to achieve it, to have that awareness. I think in Fort Lauderdale, you all are very familiar with sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding. Sometimes you call it king tides. When we have those highest high tides of the year in September, October, you probably have nuisance flooding, and it might be hard to, walk to your car. Like this guy on the bottom right in Annapolis is trying to get to Starbucks and he's holding his shoes. Just the awareness of saying, I want to be more resilient. I'm aware that there's a problem, there's a risk there of flooding, and we want to be better. And then adaptation is the next kind of answer, is how do we get there? We have to change something. Maybe it's we change our behaviors, such as having to close a beach because it's eroded, or having to take off my shoes to go to Starbucks. Or in the bottom left, that picture actually is from St. Augustine. Our good friend there, Lisa and I, Leslie Keys, she does historic preservation, and she was actually there during Hurricane Matthew when they had flooding. And this is a photo of their temporary flood barrier. You can see it's just wood and plastic, but it worked. It actually held the water back. It's a Home Depot solution, but it was a way of doing a very temporary adaptation measure that protected that historic property in flooding. And the last thing is acceptance. It's just kind of knowing that this water is going to be with us. We can't 100% get rid of it. So that, to me, these are kind of the triple A's when it comes to resilience. So then moving forward on the next slide, I want to talk really about what I've seen in the state of Florida in the last 4 years since I've been in consulting back in my home state. It started with this Florida Resilient Coastlines program. It's funded through the Department of Environmental Protection. They had 13 projects, about $500,000 worth of grant projects. They required no match. They were giving about between $50,000 and $75,000 to municipalities. You see on the map to the right some examples of some municipalities, 25 of them that had been awarded these grants. What they did with the grants was they did a vulnerability assessment, like Lisa had discussed, just looking at where are we vulnerable, and also asking the community, where do we need to adapt? What parts of the community are important to you of the things that are exposed to flooding? And some of the communities actually did it because of this peril of flood compliance. And it was a statute enacted in 2011 that required any coastal communities to include the peril of flood, in quotes, I say, it's a state statute. And it's including in the comprehensive plans coastal management element that we have looked at sea level rise and we want to be more resilient. And I want to applaud Fort Lauderdale because they do have that. And you guys have some really great language in your coastal management element about peril of flood. So I think I've actually used it as a model for some I've written for other municipalities. So thanks for being a good example and leading the way on that. And then that was just in 2018, they had this, $500,000 of project. And you can see since 2018, they've now had 100 projects funded, but not all on this graph. This is an old graphic, about $7 million total. So about $72,000 per community. So I'll talk about how this has matured. So on the next slide, I want to talk about new legislation. So 2 years ago, the legislature decided that any state funding that was either passed through to them or being appropriated for major construction along the coast, and what we define as the coastal building zone, DEP had to mandate a sea level impact projection. We call it SLIP. SLIP study. And I was fortunate enough that DEP called me and said, hey, can you put together this for us? So we were trying to make it easy to do a SLIP study. So we took my team's engineering brain and modeling, and we created this publicly available SLIP tool where anyone in the state of Florida can go in and see what sea level rise will do. You can see sea level rise is even in there. It's just sea level impact projections. It creates a study that is actually submitted to DEP to allow a permit to progress with state funding. So we're trying to make things easy with the SLIP tool, but it's a great step forward. So, and then last year, the next slide, Kim, the legislation here is that in 2021 was the Resilient Florida program. So if you haven't heard of it, it passed unanimously, both houses. So it's very hard to get bipartisan support on things like this, but this one definitely had a lot of bipartisan support. And I was proud of the legislature for being very forward thinking in this, because I don't see a lot of other states doing this. The big number there is, I think I just told you we had $500,000 of funding in 2018. This year we have $520 million in Resilient Florida grant program. Yeah, it's huge. And what is great about it is it's not just for vulnerability assessments, which the other ones were. It's actually taking communities who've already done those vulnerability assessments and giving them ability to apply for actual adaptation projects, things that are, looking for stormwater capacity and stormwater drainage and protecting the most critical assets that we care about. And I love the way the state defined critical assets. If you look at this graphic on the right, that actually comes from a slide from a webinar that the state did last year when they introduced this bill, once it was signed into law. And you can see that, it's transportation assets is their number one, then critical infrastructure, critical community facilities, ones we think of as critical assets. But I love in number 4, they actually put natural, cultural, and historic resources listed as a critical asset. So communities who have completed a vulnerability assessment in accordance with the state standards can apply for that $520 million of funding to help protect historic and cultural assets within their county or city. So it's really great. It's very forward thinking. I'm so glad the legislature is getting, putting money where their mouth is and really, really looking to be progressive on this. And then this session has been even more exciting. So just a couple weeks ago, they combined a whole bunch of bills together, and this House Bill 7053, almost unanimous, it only had 1 nay vote, I think it had 4 abstain, and it established an official Office of Resilience within the Executive Office of the Governor and allowed for appointment of a Chief Resilience Officer. And of course, if you've lived in Florida, you're like, wait, we've had one of those. We've had one for the last 4 years, but it was executive order. It wasn't something that the legislature had voted on. So now it has been agreed upon by the legislature. The governor still has to sign this in, but we have good communication from what I've heard is that this is definitely going to pass. Another thing that was in this bill was that now those vulnerability assessments, they have to be done for all communities in Florida, not just coastal. It was all coastal because of parallel flood. Now it has to be done for all communities, including the term in the bill said non-coastal. I think some terms I've heard is areas not affected by sea level rise or inland flooding, but that's great. It also means that for City of Fort Lauderdale, there's more competition for that $500 million. They also required projects now to these these adaptation projects I mentioned, they have to be ranked because there are evaluation criteria that are undergoing rulemaking right now that evaluates where you fall within those tiers of critical assets that were on the last slide. And within that ranking, there's a prioritization, and that has to actually be cleared by the legislature before the funding is approved, since it is state funding. And they also in this bill is that it's a minimum of $100 million of funding every year within state statute that has to go towards resilience planning and implementation, which I think is really, really, really exciting. Right, so now we'll move away from legislation. I'm not a lawyer, I'm just an engineer who happens to work with the state, so I'm really familiar with policy. So I want to talk about risk mapping, since that's what I do as an engineer most often. So I've been studying sea level rise for the last 15 years before it was a trendy term. That's what I got my PhD in, and just how you adapt and how you deal with it. So I want to just back up to this global mean sea level rise. This is the global trend. This comes, you can see from the bottom, from data out of Australia and Colorado. Really what I want you to see is there's 140 years of data. But if you just look within the last 100 years, we had about 3 inches of sea level rise in that first 50 years of the gauge. So, 1900 to 1950. Then we had another kind of 3 inches of sea level rise in that next 50 years, 1950 to 2000. But then look at that last thing on the bottom, and you can kind of see the steepness of this slope. From 2000 to 2018, we had, once again, if you take out 2022, it's another 3 inches of sea level rise. So what you're seeing is an acceleration. You know, we were at about 1.5 millimeters a year, and we're now at this steeper slope of, we've doubled. So the rate of sea level rise has accelerated. There's a couple different reasons for this. Obviously, you know, the one that we see the most often is you hear about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. There's also glacial rebound causing subsidence. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you some pictures about why that's a key thing. So imagine, if you can, the glaciers that, you know, were here way before us, and they compressed down the plates and the land that was there, and they since have receded. What's interesting is that land is just rebounding now. So that's why if you look over in Alaska in that top left corner, you see they actually have negative sea level rise. That's not because the seas are different there globally. It's just that their land is actually uplifting. It's this glacial rebound because of the glaciers had compressed, and now that land is actually rebounding. And then in the center of the Gulf of Mexico there in Louisiana and Louisiana Delta, what you see is actually probably the worst sea level rise in all of the US right now. And that's because they have groundwater and oil extraction. You think of, if we're pumping oil in the United States, where is it? Gulf of Mexico area primarily. Well, when you pull that out of underground, what happens is those layers of ground that had oil between them are now settling. So they're having vertical land movement in the opposite direction of Alaska. It's actually compressing. So while the water, the sea level rise globally is going up, you're having things that go on with the land. The great thing to know is we do not have any vertical land movement in Florida, or if we do, it's very negligible from the geologists that I talked to, because we're built on really good limestone. The bad thing with the limestone, though, is it's Swiss cheese, so we've got some sea level rise kind of comes up from underneath, and that's when you see the octopus in the parking lot pictures in Miami, and you think, how did that get there? So the good news, I would say, is in Fort Lauderdale, we're keeping with the global average at 3 millimeters a year I showed on the previous slide. And if you want to look at this yourself, this comes from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's website on sea level trends. But now I want to bring it home a little bit closer to what we're looking at in sea level rise projections. You probably saw about a month ago, it was all over the news that we've had, a foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years, and we're expecting another foot or so in the next 50 years. And it's really hitting close to home in areas that are low-lying, like Annapolis, Maryland, where Lisa and I used to live, Norfolk, Virginia, the Louisiana Delta area, New Orleans, Miami-Dade County, Broward County are seeing it more often. And NOAA has been charged by the National Climate Assessment every 5 years to come out with sea level rise projections. The reason I'm showing you 2017 and not the ones that came out last month, it's not because I'm out of date. It's because the state of Florida has, in their legislation I just showed you, requirements to use these NOAA 2017 projections, and specifically 2 of the curves. So that very bottom curve, the 0.3 millimeters, that's actually that 3 millimeters per year, right? That's the trend. Then what they did was they had 5 other curves. And the red and the blue arrows is where I want to show you is the state has mandated, if you want Resilient Florida grant funding, which is kind of a great 520 million this year source of funding for adaptation, you have to use both the NOAA intermediate low, that's the reddish curve and the red arrows, and the NOAA intermediate high, that's the kind of the purpley with the blue arrows. And the arrows are offset a little bit, but in the 2040 and the 2040, so 20 years from now, and 2070, about 50 years from now, timeframes. We can go to the next slide because I'm going to show you some graphics that show what this looks like in Fort Lauderdale. Another thing to be aware of what's going on in Florida, Lisa talked a lot about collaboration and having good collaboration between other governments. Southeast Florida has that Southeast Florida Regional Compact on climate change, and they have unified sea level rise projections, and Fort Lauderdale has been a member of this. And your city, the mayors and city council actually signed an ordinance saying we will use the unified climate projections. So I'll show you what these look like because they're slightly different than the ones I just showed you of the NOAA, which the state requires, which is why there's kind of there's like a fine point on this that the state and I discuss often in our work. So Kim, go to the next slide. We've got, these are the sea level rise projections coming out of Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. They made them very specific to Southeast Florida. And what they did was, instead of using the big NOAA global, US projections, they took the Key West gauge. That's what you see on the y-axis there. And they said, what's the Key West gauge look like relative to the year 2000? What is that sea level rise going to be between the year 2000 and certain years? You can see they did pick the 2040 and 2070 as future years to look at. But City of Fort Lauderdale said for all future planning, we will use the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's median projections, the NOAA intermediate high, which is the top end of the one the state uses. And then also for really big infrastructure, we'll look at the NOAA high terminology. So those are what is mandated for the City of Fort Lauderdale to use. So just so you're aware of, it's different than what the state has. So if you want state funding, you have to kind of do both vulnerability assessments. But what we're doing for you will get you the ability to say, yep, we already looked at this. So now I'll show you some maps, because the maps I think are the most fun. Well, I don't know if they're fun, but they're maps, they're informational. They're not really fun when it comes talking about flooding. So I said the state has those 4 sea level rise scenarios you have to use. The first one is the 2040, about 20 years from now when we started this legislation, intermediate low. You can see the legend there. Historic properties are in this kind of teal blue. You can see them scattered throughout the city. You can see the light brown, that's the Fort Lauderdale Historic District, just north of New River there. The archaeological zones are something that Lisa talked about that's important to Fort Lauderdale and the Historic Preservation Master Plan. And those are the kind of the dotted areas. What we find in those is a lot of them are scattered under something that's underground, and they're very susceptible to sea level rise because saltwater intrusion can damage things that are there. So that's why the archaeological zones are really important when we talk about sea level rise and protecting for sea level rise. So the dark blue is actually the flood scenarios. So this one doesn't look horrible, right? Because it's the coding there is sea level rise at 0.69 feet, which you can conceptualize, that's 8¼ inches or so. And that's above mean higher high water, which mean higher high water is the NOAA term for describing the highest high tides of the year on average. So think about that as that's your nuisance flood. That's the mean higher high water. So imagine 8 inches at your doorstep above the mean higher high water. If you go to the beach, think about what 8 inches higher than where we are. If you have a seawall, think about what that is. That's the intermediate low NOAA projection for 2040, specific to Fort Lauderdale. Let's go ahead. I won't have to describe all these on the next ones. So now we're looking at the NOAA 2040, but intermediate high, so the next higher projection. This one's 1.4 feet. So you're starting to see a little bit more flooding down there on the southwest side of the city boundary. New River, the New River is kind of overflowing its boundaries a little. Las Olas area, you're seeing overflowing in some of the canals. And this is 1 foot and about 5 inches. Let's go to the next one because it gets better and then it gets worse. So now we moved out the 50-year time frame to that 2070, and we're looking at 1¼ foot above mean higher high water. So it's real similar to the last one. But go to the next one because the next one is where it gets a little more severe. So now it's that intermediate high. That's that like worst case. That's the 50-year 3.28 sea level rise. So that's 3 feet 3 inches. And you're seeing, the green that's there is what we call like shallow water ponding. So when it floods, the water doesn't drain off because it's kind of like a little bathtub there. But I mean, look down on the southwest side, right where all those archaeological zones are on the edge of the city boundary. I'm seeing a lot of flooding up just south of Wilton Manors. I'm seeing a lot of flooding right there too. And especially along the intercoastal, it's really just water overflowing its banks. This is the NOAA sea level rise data set. So it doesn't account for things like, it has topography in there, but doesn't account for seawalls that have been built higher in the last few years. So that's just kind of the worst case of where we are. Now I want to show how it integrates with some other things that Fort Lauderdale is doing. So go ahead and move forward. So this is the special flood hazard area. So this is the FEMA flood hazard layer. And what I want to show you are I'm going to start from the coast and work in, because that's typically where the water is coming from. So all of the areas that you see that are colored in light blue or lavender or pink, those are the 1% annual chance storm, or what we call the 100-year storm surge. It doesn't occur every 100 years because obviously you can have more than 100-year storms. This happens to be the water level that's associated with what we used to see every 100 years, which now is coming a little more soon. The VE zone is that bright pink. When I see VE, I think that's a coastal area that has wave overtopping and erosional effects on the dunes. My company works for FEMA, so we actually help create these flood maps. So I've looked at the Broward maps very intensely. I did some of the review of them a few years ago. So I've actually looked at, parcel by parcel, how does this wave from the coast travel inbound? So I really understand how the flood mapping is done. It is historic, though. It doesn't account for future conditions such as sea level rise, but they're working at adding that. And then you see that blue. So the next set is kind of that blue area. That's the AE zone. AE are areas, once again, the 1% annual chance flood, but it's just that wave is just flowing the water in. when you see the purple, so you're now, if you think of now you're west of the intercoastal, you're west of all those areas that unfortunately are underwater, that lavender or purple is what we call the AH. And AH to me is shallow flooding. It's ponding. It's that green from the previous one. It's literally a bathtub. It's a very low lying area that averaged between 1 to 3 feet deep of water. These are probably the areas where you're having sunny day flooding now. And so the AH and the AO also, AO happens to be a sheet flow on sloping terrain. So not a wave, but a sheet flow. But you can see the historic district and the historic properties that we've outlined. The Sailboat Bend area is falling right on the edge of the New River. Those areas are at risk, as well as a lot of the historic properties that you see throughout the county. They're right on the edge of this 100-year flood. So that's looking at flood vulnerability. Now I want to talk about what Fort Lauderdale is doing that actually helps adaptation and make these things better. So Fort Lauderdale has a very unique thing, or the state of Florida does, called adaptation action areas. I'll define it on the next slide, but what I want you to understand is that all these little black dots that you see, we've superimposed them on top of that 2070 intermediate high, that 3.28 feet of flooding. And you see that they happen to occur mostly in the areas where we had seen increased flooding, which it's kind of the areas I concentrated on that we talked about. And if I was to overlay these on the one we just looked at with the FEMA flood polygons, real similar. They're showing up in areas where flooding has been experienced in the past, and the city wants to adapt these areas. So let's talk about what a AAA is. So on the next slide, we'll talk about, an adaptation action area was something the legislature actually created. So once again, forward thinking. 11 years ago, they said, we're going to do something about this. And it was optional. So not every city has this. And I want to applaud Fort Lauderdale, because Fort Lauderdale has once again led the way in this, kind of like y'all did for peril of flood in your comp plan. But for coastal communities with that coastal management element, you can identify an area that is experiencing coastal flooding, identify it as like an area, big square footage or acreage or square mileage, and prioritize it for funding for increasing resilience and adaptation. So if you go to the next slide, I want to show some examples of the ones that are in Fort Lauderdale that I think are fabulous. So there was a pilot study done on adaptation action areas that was led by the Department of Economic Opportunity, DEO, at the state agency, with the South Florida Regional Planning Council in 2013. So those guys that do that South Florida Regional Climate Compact. And they looked at 3 different areas, and city of Fort Lauderdale was one that was chosen. They actually got an award of special merit from NOAA for it because it was such a great study and great pilot. What it does is it takes all these little areas that you see over here, and we just put in a couple of them. We put in the Sailboat Ben, that pinkish polygon, and then the green one, because those are where the historic districts are. And I think there are 10 AAA adaptation action areas within the city of Fort Lauderdale, but they show up in the city's community investment plan, which means that your public works staff are actually looking, and your commission and your mayor are applying funding, they're looking for funding, they've secured funding. Some of these projects have even been completed. So if you go to the next page, I'm going to zoom in on Sailboat Ben and Riverwalk District because they're really important to this. The Sailboat Ben here has 2 different stormwater improvement projects specific, to how do we help the drainage in that area. So sometimes when you think I'm going to protect the historic property, you can't just look at the parcel. You have to think, what is affecting the whole neighborhood? So just by doing stormwater improvement for a whole neighborhood can affect, the sheet flooding on the street or the flooding that's overtopping the seawall. So those are really key. And then on the next slide, you'll see this is the Riverwalk District. So just to the east of Sailboat Ben, you can see where they overlap there. And you can see where we've got the historic district is right in the middle of that, and those historic properties. There's actually 6 projects in Riverwalk. So stormwater improvements, like on the last one, some emergency generators for storm stations, electrical improvements, and also seawall replacement. So there's a variety of adaptations that can be made, but I love that Fort Lauderdale is actually moving forward with this action and doing something about it. It's just something we don't see in a lot of other cities. And I work in a lot of other cities and I work for the state directly. So thanks for leading the way. All right, Lisa, on to you. I'll stick around though.
Thanks, Angela. So I think that gives you some context. It's really important that we look at all of the overlays that impact the historic district. And actually, I think there's great opportunities for the city of Fort Lauderdale. We're going to hammer home on the fact that it's important to identify historic resources that are at risk, and it's important to get them into the planning documents. because only then will those funds be available. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through, and I might pull Angela in and out based on some experiences she's had in Florida and what we've worked on together. So next slide.
Lisa, I can hear you, but not see you. I don't know if you're not sharing your video.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now I'm there. Thanks.
Got your back.
I appreciate it. So climate and disaster resilience planning, we do a lot of this work in Florida. And one of the things that we take a look at is what is the guiding documentation? We talked about collaboration, integration of other planning efforts. It's really important that when we're looking at, and we certainly will be doing this, the preservation plan for the city of Fort Lauderdale, that we start by looking in the resilience area under what is already in plans at the state level. So the state hazard mitigation plan for the state of Florida is a document that we'll be taking some direction and guidance from. We talked about the critical assets that historic and cultural resources now represent. So it's a terrific way to insert historic properties into future updates of the state hazard mitigation plan. Florida has a Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook. I'll talk a little bit about another community in Florida that has adopted an adaptation plan. So this guidebook provides information about how to deal with those adaptation action areas and how to go about adapting communities to future sea level rise and disaster impacts. Disaster
it does
planning.
have a chapter for historic too.
Oh, yes, thank you. And it does have
Apalachicola is a case study in it. So that's really key to, there is a great example in there.
Yeah, and thank you, Angela. I think that's the thing that we appreciate greatly, and perhaps we don't have the opportunity in other states that we work in to see this kind of guidance in place. So again, Florida has, I don't want to use that term again, but a sea change in how it is recognizing and funding these efforts. Disaster planning for Florida's historic resources. This is an older publication, but what's important about it is currently being updated. So this provides information about how to better plan and prepare for disasters in the state of Florida, what types of methods, whether we're dealing with hurricanes, high wind events, coastal flooding, how to deal with disasters in the state specific to historic resources. And then lastly, but a very important tool that we need to have in place in the instance of recovery, and that is a post-disaster redevelopment planning guide. So again, historic properties are actually referenced in this post-disaster redevelopment planning, taking into account that if you do have damage or destruction in certain neighborhoods or with certain historic resources, what can you do to build back in a more sustainable, resilient way and protect the historic character of the district that remains. And then Angela had mentioned Resilient Florida. And again, extremely important when we're looking at planning efforts. We've already succeeded in Fort Lauderdale with incorporating resilience into the comprehensive plan amendments. We now need to take a look at and developing the preservation plan relevant to the resilience, what the vulnerability is of some of the most important places in the community, and develop adaptation strategies and resilience strategies for those resources. Because as we've come to understand, the state sees as critical assets for funding natural, cultural, and historic places. Next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an adaptation plan. We talked about adaptation plans being another tool that can be used. In Pensacola, there are a number of items, basically objectives they have in their planning process for adaptation. And many of these actually tie into historic and cultural resources. So for example, when I was in the city of Annapolis, we worked extremely closely with our emergency management personnel to ensure that we incorporated at that time climate change projections and adaptation strategies into the city's hazard mitigation plan. And this was actually driven by the state plan, which was requiring a review of the importance of cultural and historic resources. You can utilize local authorities to protect open space and wetlands to increase resilience If we protect those open spaces, then they are there to absorb more of the impact from extreme precipitation events. Incorporating better site design, low impact development, and green infrastructure principles. Look at living shorelines. We can often take a look at historic properties, particularly coastal properties, and layer adaptation strategies so that we're creating the best opportunity to protect the property, but at the same time, not automatically going to an elevation of the building when other strategies for reducing flood risk may be in place. Developing permeable surfaces and green incentives. I think that is an important thing to look into and consider. We'll be looking at incentives that can work in Fort Lauderdale, as may have been adopted by other communities. Stormwater fee reduction based on beneficial pervious surface areas. We already talked about the fact that we have so many stormwater projects going on, which is a terrific thing. So it's something that we constantly have to keep in mind because that stormwater system needs to be upgraded, and it's currently not able to accept the level and the capacity of water that we're now seeing hitting our communities. Looking at grant opportunities to provide direct funding to property owners. There are ways in which you can do that, funneling those funds through a local government. Maybe developing a rebate program or providing financing or tax credit to property owners who are trying to make their properties more resilient, more reducing the risk to flooding and disaster events. An awards and recognition program. Who is doing some great jobs of resilience planning? Are they doing it at the neighborhood level? Are they doing it on a property basis? Let's highlight those initiatives and efforts by community members, by property owners as examples for others. Where is it frequently flooding? Angela was talking about it, showed you the map of what in essence would be nuisance flooding areas, but creating a public database for people to report where they are seeing nuisance flooding occurring so that you'll have up-to-date timely information. And then partnering on innovative construction projects, you can showcase changes that mitigate for flooding, getting the media interested in and learning more about the fact that new construction projects that may be infill or may be sympathetic to the character of the city or the historic district need to be showcased. Next slide. So some of the best practices for climate and disaster resilience. When we're developing, whether it's preservation plans or as we have done in the city of St. Augustine with its resilient heritage in the nation's oldest city strategy initiative, what are some of the things that can be done? So looking at updating the zoning ordinance to incentivize flood adaptation for historic resources, not just the stick of regulation, but the carrot of a financial incentive. Looking at flooding adaptation incentives in terms of even a regulatory approach. Some people are looking at transfer of development rights. If you move the property further inland, if there's public land, if there's zoning changes that can occur, to regulate for development on the interior versus in a coastal area. So we can look both at financial incentives and regulatory incentives. Integrating historic properties into resilience planning, your local mitigation strategy, which we've been talking about. If we can get information in there, if we can get certain historic properties identified or infrastructure in historic neighborhoods, as we saw, identified as priority projects, then once they're in the LMS, the local mitigation strategy, which is updated every 5 years, then you can seek funding. Keeping in mind historic view sheds. It may be that there is zoning in place that would actually allow higher heights for construction, but in building in those areas, it would mean that you would have to elevate the property considerably. So keeping in mind, identifying the historic view sheds and limiting construction in those scenic vistas. Updating the state plan or the city plan to be consistent with the state plan. Surveying, photo documenting, and 3D laser scanning some of the most vulnerable historic properties. conducting the archaeological survey. We have archaeological information, but it is not complete. And we need to overlay it with those areas of vulnerability to understand where archaeological resources are impacted. Something we'll probably talk about a bit more at the workshop is collecting economic impact data. So one of the wonderful projects that we had as part of the Resilient Heritage in St. Augustine was an economic assessment, not just of the value of historic resources, of heritage assets, of tourism to the city of St. Augustine, but what would be the cost and what has been the cost to the city when disaster strikes? What is at stake? What does the city have at risk? So important data that needs to be collected for many communities that are addressing this issue of coastal disasters and the need for greater resilience. Mentioned previously, developing adaptation design guidelines specifically for flooding events. And then a disaster preparedness toolkit. It's not necessarily just having design guidelines in place. What are the other things that property owners need to know about? Flood insurance, strategies for, preparing their home, their family for emergency preparedness. What about if you're a cultural institution? What if you have significant collections? How do you prepare for a disaster in that particular instance? What kind of training might be needed for museum sites, for example? And how about business owners? Do you have a continuity plan in place, a business continuity plan in place in case there is a disaster and you're considering alternative locations for operating your business or online resources? So all of these things are best practices within climate and disaster resilience planning. Next slide. Okay, a little bit to know, and we're going to kind of steal a little bit from St. Augustine as we're looking at Fort Lauderdale to see if some of what is already in the St. Augustine Preservation Master Plan may work nicely into the comp plan priorities for historic preservation. Next slide. So, for example, we talked about ensuring that your zoning is consistent with neighborhood character. If we take a look at the floodplain management ordinances that are in place, many times communities basically develop a floodplain management ordinance that exempts historic properties from having to meet any type of mitigation or adaptation of properties if they're doing significant new construction. We kind of don't want that. We really want to find ways to reduce risk to those properties. So really understanding if there is a middle ground, reducing risk, but perhaps not being as stringent as you might be with new construction. We mentioned the need for overlays to protect vistas around historic resources. Looking at flood mitigation and the character of neighborhoods. Again, you know, when we look at a neighborhood of two-story homes, if we elevate that building by a full story, are we changing the character of that particular streetscape, that view shed? So really looking at limiting the height of the first floor to reduce the overall elevated building height. In other words, if it is something where we need to increase the height of the building by 3.5 feet to get out of the design, to meet a design flood elevation and get out of that flood zone, then let's do that. I don't think that the city supports raising it 6 feet so you can park underneath the buildings. So the concept here is being sensitive to the character of the neighborhood. Requiring screening for elevated foundations and raised equipment can be done in a very attractive way. Revising the architectural guidelines to incorporate flood and storm mitigation alternatives. It can be done, and both through materials and through design, you can actually create adaptation alternatives that actually would take you out of flood risk and would lower flood insurance for properties. And then allowing broader use of staff approval. After a major hazard event, is there an opportunity for staff to do administrative approvals quickly so that you don't have to come in front of a commission member? And meanwhile, the mold continues to grow on the interior of your property. So what are things that can be done very quickly? Next slide. And then again, other strategies to incorporate the local mitigation strategy or the hazard mitigation planning process. Those plans must be updated every 5 years. The historic preservation community, the staff should be at the table at the update of those preservation plans. Documenting the historic and cultural resources that are at the highest level of risk for understanding the hazards. Providing protection, starting with city-owned properties. The city has more ability to control its properties and adapt them than obviously any other private properties. So starting with that as a model for adaptation. I mentioned an expedited review process for disaster response. Identifying partners to assist in post-flood review. What's really important about this is the fact that you need a team, you need a triage team. You need to be able in a post-disaster scenario to be able to call a particular architect, an engineer, an archaeologist, a preservationist, a structural engineer, your building code official. Who are the people that you can pull together locally to help you do assessment for post-flood review? Debris management plan, interesting concept, and it's already in place in many Florida communities. But the idea with historic properties is if we have debris management, let's take a look at some of those historic features and elements that might have blown off a property and could be salvaged and brought back to that property. So having some type of debris management plan that incorporates what to do with artifacts or building features to restore them and return them to their rightful properties. An integrated plan for historic preservation into the local response. So it goes both ways. Having in this preservation plan information about how emergency management can engage with the preservation community and vice versa. Doing a toolkit for property owners. And then again, design guidelines. Next slide. So I'm going to move now into just a few little pieces on adaptation, how you can adapt buildings and what some of the FEMA adaptation alternatives are. So when we talk about adapting for future conditions, for flood risk, for disaster, we're not just talking about physical changes to building. We're talking about things like prevention. Prevention includes policy changes in how in land use, in building codes, in our preservation ordinances. So what are things that we can do to support prevention of the loss of resources to disaster events and to climate impacts? Structural are often those big things, the seawall, developing some type of a berm, whether it's a landscape berm that can protect in a nature-based approach. What are those things that have to be built, designed, flood systems? What do we need to put in place? Property protection is everything else that we as individual property owners would be looking at. That's dry and wet flood proofing, that is temporary protection measures, that's building elevation, relocation, that all falls under property protection. Nature-based strategies, as I mentioned earlier, can be everything from living shorelines to rain gardens. I mean, the fact of the matter is you can be fairly creative on how nature-based strategies are used. Again, not a lot tonight, but we will talk a little bit more about those options at the workshop. And then finally, the easiest thing to do is to increase public awareness and educate property owners about what's at risk, tools that may be available for them, and also the unique needs of historic properties, the importance of protecting those historic properties and how they can be adapted. You can take advantage of things like Preservation Month, Hurricane Awareness Week, which happens in May, as well as Preservation Month. Basically Emergency Preparedness Month, which is in September. So a lot of times and periods to recognize the need to protect and create greater resilience for historic places. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of turn it over, I think, from here for Kim to talk a little bit about strategies for adaptation, and then we'll wrap up with a final question to you all and take some opportunity for some questions and engagement. Kim?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. So the document on the right side is one of my favorite documents. It's the Guidelines on Flood Adaptation for Rehabilitating Historic Buildings. And it comes from the Secretary of the Interior and the National Park Service. And really what it helps communities do is create their own guidelines for flood adaptation. And below we have some communities listed that have already done this. Nantucket being one that published theirs right after this document was released and was able to utilize that as a resource. But also there are some other items that come from FEMA or come from other sources, such as raising utilities above the flood level, as you see in the little photo on the far left, which is a hot water heater and a furnace elevated on a platform, whether that's on the first floor or in a basement. It's still elevated out of the water in order to protect that. Installing hurricane straps, which is required by the state of Florida, or elevating on foundation walls or fill in order to get your building and to get you and your personal belongings above the flood water to keep it out of harm's way. Now, Lisa mentioned earlier some terms, one of which was wet flood proofing. And this is essentially allowing water to come into your building. And a lot of people think that's absolutely insane. However, it is a little bit more affordable than some of the other options. And it's really effective if you do have a crawl space or basement to move those utilities, to put in flood vents to allow that water to move in and then move back out as the water begins to recede after that flooding event. And this really helps with keeping walls from collapsing due to too much pressure from the water or debris impact sometimes. Now, if it is actually your first floor that you are deciding to wet flood proof, you can install a chair rail to prevent the wicking or water resistance materials. Even historic materials like lime plaster is mold resistant. And all you had to do is drill some holes into it after flooding to let it air out versus the drywall and sheetrock that we use today as more modern materials. Another term Lisa mentioned was dry flood proofing. And this is kind of the opposite. This is keeping water out. It's over there. It is not in here. Here on our screen, we have some examples of that being implemented for commercial sites. It is a little bit more of an expensive option, but it can be temporary, such as the one on the right, where that doors just slid into place, which means you are required to be there in order to implement that. But there's also even more temporary that a lot of people are familiar with, such as putting in sandbags before an event. That is supposed to keep the water out, or temporary flood membranes to cover the entry points of entry possible. Oftentimes, dry flood proofing and wet flood proofing are combined. So you may try to implement a dry flood proofing technique on the outside, such as that temporary membrane, but you decide to wet flood proof on the inside just in case something happens. And really, dry flood proofing and wet flood proofing are only effective for under 3 to 4 feet of water. And it's because of that water pressure that causes those devices to fail. Alternatively, there is a adaptation called interior elevation. Typically, this is seen in buildings that have high ceilings. So you can see it in residential buildings in Charleston, South Carolina. Here, this is a commercial building in Galveston, Texas, where they've elevated the inside of this storefront and created a ramp for ADA access and some stairs for people to walk up in order to access that merchandise, but so the water can't access the merchandise. So it's keeping that area free of water within the Strand Historic District. And this also helps because it doesn't change the appearance of the storefront from the outside. So along the street, if you didn't know that this had happened, you would just assume it was a regular storefront. Now there's also exterior elevation, and this you do see from the street or from the area. As Lisa was saying, it can change the character of a streetscape. And this is when a building is raised. And there are site considerations, there's streetscape context, there's landscaping that can help mitigate some of the height difference that occurs for exterior elevation. And there's different kinds. You can raise it up on piers or piles. You can put in a new foundation or extend the current foundation if it's structurally sound. And then another option is complete relocation, and that is moving the property from one location to the other. The Secretary of the Interior doesn't prefer this as an option. However, it recognizes that sometimes it has to happen. And they allow it when a property is relocated to a comparable historic setting. So I live in Nantucket, Massachusetts. There's a history of moving buildings. Matter of fact, they're shutting down a series of streets because a house is moving from one side of the island to the other side of the island tomorrow. And so on Nantucket, that's a little bit more of an accepted response to flooding and sea level rise here, because it is part of the history of Nantucket, is reusing those buildings. Other places, it may not be part of the history or heritage of a location. And so the Park Service would view that in a different light as well. And I will hand it back over to Lisa to bring us home with some financing.
Sure. Okay, we talked about money that is available for projects. So just
Hey,
a
Lisa,
series. Yes.
your camera's off still.
Oh, I hit it. There we go. It's on again. A couple of options that are available, and Angela can certainly chime in at some point to reinforce what she has been learning recently. As I mentioned previously, you can develop a mitigation rebate in your community for people who actually on their own property are trying to work with improving the stormwater issues. So a couple of examples of that we will be providing down the road again at the workshop. I've already talked about perhaps incorporating as part of the ad valorem exemption at the local level in Florida, some type of mitigation as an option for getting an incentive off of that. Public-private partnerships are usually fairly large-scale projects where the city is working with a private individual to offset some of the costs associated with a larger mitigation or stormwater project. FEMA grants, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is out there. Angela, I think that's what you've said has been funding a lot of the stormwater work in Fort Lauderdale right now.
Yeah, well, considering that we've had we always seem to have a busy hurricane season. And so the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, I know at least here in this area, they're still recovering from Matthew and Irma. And so there seems to be my local mitigation strategies up and down the east coast of Florida tend to come, a lot of the funding comes from them.
And so that is a huge benefit to the historic districts, because as Angela said, it's really at the neighborhood level. And that's where we can start to minimize some of the flood risk. But then there's also a very large program called BRIC. And it really it can help with survey work. I've had a very interesting discussion with the grants manager at FEMA in your community, because one of your elements is to look at historic survey and assess not only additional properties for incorporation into historic districts, but even more importantly, looking at city-owned assets. Survey, as long as there's vulnerability assessments incorporated into those typical historic resource surveys, BRIC can help to fund those programs. National Park Service grants are usually after the fact recovery grants, and sometimes they don't come for 18 months to 2 years after. So in essence, they're usually used more for planning and preparedness efforts, for documentation, for future post-development. You could look at, or post-disaster redevelopment plans. There's a lot of things they can be used for: education, training. We used a Park Service grant in Annapolis that came after Sandy to pay for a conference, Keeping History Above Water. So lots of ways they can be used. There are HUD grants available, community development block grants. There's something called a Rebuild Florida Critical Facility Hardening Program underneath the HUD grant specifically for the state of Florida. And then there's other resources available through local authorities. The state of Florida gives to municipalities. And again, something fairly complex we'll go into later, but not today. And then, relocating with the city, interesting approach that after Sandy up in New York, they took advantage in one neighborhood of planning for a relocation of a neighborhood that had been devastated by Sandy, and actually worked with the city to find locations where they could relocate properties and encourage people to relocate within the city and not depart the city, giving them incentives so they would stay in the city versus leaving. So again, an incentive-based program. And then finally, other market-based incentives that can be developed to encourage property owners, developers to support adaptation of buildings in historic areas. Next slide. Okay, so this is a question to you all. And since we don't have chat available, if you would like to raise your hand or just be acknowledged in some way, turn your camera on. We really need to find out what tools would be most beneficial to you, whether it's a tool that is for the city of Fort Lauderdale in general that would benefit many property owners, or if it's just something that you as a property owner, as a commission member, as a board member would be interested in having in a toolkit for resilience and preservation planning. Here is one example, a little brochure that Apalachicola put together that the floodplain management information, when they looked at their floodplain management ordinance, they realized that it mentioned what to do with historic properties. So they worked very closely with their floodplain manager and developed a brochure, and they've given it to every single property owner in the historic district. So again, they can be fairly simple little tools that are available, or a little more complicated. We've talked a lot about some of these disaster adaptation design guidelines, making sure that there is a hazard mitigation plan for the historic district. That's what we had specifically done in the city of Annapolis, designed our own cultural resource-based hazard mitigation plan. Or you can incorporate historic and cultural resources into the city's existing local mitigation strategy. A toolkit for disaster planning, conducting an economic analysis of the value of historic preservation to your community, and also an assessment of disaster cost. 3D visual documentation. I think that's something that's extremely interesting. We'll show a little bit more about that on the workshop, and it's very cutting edge work coming out of the University of Florida, specifically working primarily in historic communities. Public policy guidance for adaptation, public education and awareness toolkits for preparedness. And then the basic, a fact sheet, a resource list of successful adaptation strategies for historic properties and cultural resources. All really effective and useful tools that have been tried and are in place in other communities throughout the country. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions or wants to raise their hand and indicate, hey, I really would like that tool, we'd love to hear from you. Oh, Ruth.
Hi there.
Hi. What's your thought?
Thanks very much for the presentation. Very interesting. Yes, I guess, of all of these options we have here, they all sound great, but I would say hazard mitigation plan for the historic district would be a great one. I mean, I didn't see our neighborhood on the flood, the action that's happening for the places that are flooding, but we really should be on it because we do flood. So, but Anyway, but I know you're going to have another session next week, so that's it for now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we will make sure when we do the workshop, we'll bring some examples of those. So you can see what it is that we're talking about and maybe page through it and get a sense of what's incorporated, because a number of these things actually find their way into a hazard mitigation plan. So thank you for that. We have anyone else? Okay. We do have a survey that has gone out. Kim, you want to hit the next slide there? There you go. If you have not yet completed the survey, you can scan this code to take that survey. And we're getting very good response. I'm very pleased with the response we're getting to date in Fort Lauderdale. And we'll end up having results of that survey available at the 31st to see what the community is saying about how preservation is important, where resilience planning may rate with them, what their concerns are, and what opportunities they really want to take advantage of through this preservation planning process. But it is the Strategic Historic Preservation Plan Workshop. It'll be on Thursday, March 31st. We'll have 2 sessions, one in the morning from 9:30 to 11:30. This is going to include anyone who would like to attend. A lot of times we find that people who are working there in the city or in government or nonprofits would be interested and available to come to a morning meeting. And then for those who cannot attend a morning meeting, we will have another evening presentation from 6 to 8. We will be doing this as a roundtable discussion with specific topics that tie directly to those preservation plan elements that we had reviewed earlier. And so there is information about that. We actually do have, you can find it on the Craig Group Partners website, and you can find information from Tricia from the city on the city's website about what to anticipate for that workshop. So I do hope that you all will be ahead of the game. You'll have seen all of this, and hopefully we'll have an extremely productive discussion on the March 31st. So I want to thank you all this evening. If there's any questions you guys have, we are certainly here to hang around and answer any of those. And I'll leave it at that. Tricia, is there anything else you want to close with? Tricia lost her voice, so maybe she literally lost her voice. There you are.
I'm here. I'm so sorry. We have one more hand up if you'd like to take one.
Oh, thank you. Okay, sure. Is it Michaela?
Michaela.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Tricia. Thank you. Unfortunately, I did join a little late, but I'm wondering if all of the material that's been covered is available to us, or we'll be receiving it in handouts at the next meeting.
Yeah, Tricia, I think we've recorded it, so you will have that available to for people to see ahead of time.
Yeah, we'll be putting it on our website. We'll put the slides up on our website probably tomorrow, and then I'll be working with IT to try to get a link up for the recording of this as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing you, Michaela.
Thank you very much.
One thing we didn't say is that I forgot to say when I was doing the mapping is this mapping, while I was just showing you a snapshot of what we're seeing in the city of Fort Lauderdale, after this, it'll be an interactive web map that Kim and Lisa are putting together. So you can actually zoom into your address and look at your neighborhood and see, what it looks like. It's really hard to look at it. It's hard to look at everybody's, addresses when I'm trying to present, but it'll be more in depth and more individualized and interactive website for you to see the information we're providing.
And we may be, I think, even able to, Angela, if it's possible, to do an example of that at the workshop.
Yeah, I'll bring my laptop. I know Kim will have one. And, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for the presentation. Yeah. It was really informative and educational, and I'm glad we're going to have this available on our website for everyone to view later on and use as a resource moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you, Tricia, and thank those who participated this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all on the 31st. And thanks to my team, to Kim and Angela. A lot of research has been done ahead of this, so really appreciate their hard work as well. We'll see you all next week.
Thank
Same
you.
time, different location.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.